Today I will be speaking about the importance of multidisciplinarity in our world as we go forward, especially after this pandemic. Today I want to begin by speaking about the concept of a Renaissance man, the universal man. Now, of course, the idea of a Renaissance man refers back to the Renaissance, which was a period of cultural rebirth that occurred in Europe starting around the 14th century, some say up until the 17th, but at least up into 14th to 16th, I would say at least. Many will say up till the 17th. Now, the Renaissance actually emerged, though, from a period of crisis, very much like the period we're in today. Europe was actually subjected to a lot of political instability, famine, pestilence, which again, very much like the pandemic today. The late Middle Ages, the period right before the Renaissance, were a very uncertain time for people in Europe. But from this period of crisis, we actually begin to see a new and in many ways improved culture start to emerge. And how did this new culture emerge? Interestingly enough, European culture took a great leap forward by looking back. And that's something I want to touch on a little bit here. This is something not only that happened in the Renaissance, but most pre-modern thought tended to look back, to really look into their own traditions and into their own culture in order to reincorporate and reuse that to progress forward. That's why I said the great leap forward is produced by looking back. That's kind of an allusion to China, which also tended to look back toward a time when things were more perfect. And actually in Indian Buddhism you also see this as well. Whereas things were better before, we're in a devolution rather than an evolution. But it's not so important to get into the philosophical nitty-gritty of that. But at this time in Europe, there's a lot of chaos. But there were also a lot of rediscoveries going on, particularly when it comes to archaeology. Classical Greek philosophy was rediscovered. A lot of works, especially Aristotle and others, that had been lost for centuries suddenly re-emerged from the Middle East in translation. And this rediscovery, particularly of Greek and Greco-Roman philosophy, became manifest in your art, your architecture, politics, literature, sciences, religion. And these types of insights that were gained from that, this return to the classical knowledge, it showed us how we can change the way we think by going back to what we had thought previously. And this movement back to the classics to give birth to a new civilization is what really produced the Renaissance man. And now the Renaissance man is best exemplified by Leonardo Da Vinci, who was one of the greatest artists of all time. The Mona Lisa, The Last Supper, was an excellent painter. But he did a lot of work in astronomy, botany. He was an engineer, a mathematician. They credit him with being the founder of architecture, as it is practiced today, and paleontology. He was a jack of all trades. And as we can see, given the theme of the conference here, to be a Renaissance man really proposes multidisciplinarity. By looking back on the traditions of our ancestors, particularly the Greeks and the Romans, and applying what was learned from that study to their own day, the Renaissance man was able to attain theoretical knowledge of many diverse subjects. They were polymaths, and put this knowledge into practice in culturally significant projects, including building, art, many other things. Now, this leads me to the question, where are the Renaissance men and women of today? We don't really have them. Why were, particularly in Europe, my ancestors, but also yours in different periods, why were our ancestors able to achieve feats that really cannot be imitated today? And this is one actually, when I was in St. Peter's in Rome. Very interesting, they did modern restorations of stone cuttings. And so certain parts of the floor were modern, whereas other ones were ancient. The modern ones were very beautiful too, but they did not compare to the more ancient work. Even though we have computers, we have automated drafting, everything should be perfect, better cutting tools, it still didn't match up to the work that the ancient people had done. So with all of our technology, we still couldn't imitate that work. And when you think about it, okay, why can't we? Why don't we have Renaissance men? It can't be that our ancestors were more intelligent than we are today, because they're not. They didn't have internet and smartphones, and maybe that's the reason they did achieve so much, that they didn't have internet and smartphones, but that's a topic for another day. Nevertheless, there has to be a difference. There's something that's different between the Renaissance people and the world today. What is this? Actually, I think the answer is quite simple. It's merely a question of attitude. Due in large part to the successes of the Renaissance, the European continent went into another age, the Age of Enlightenment. This also led to a profound change in our thinking. Once again, this change resulted in really great advances in certain fields, particularly the sciences. We learned to mathematize natural sciences. We developed new methods. We began to, as Bacon said, wring the answers out of nature. We were able to subject nature to the torture rack and get the answers out of it. Now, this enlightenment, this knowledge we use to produce these new technologies, really is rooted in the Renaissance, but there's a big difference. And as the Enlightenment took over from the Renaissance man became a thing of the past. Why? I would say primarily because the difference between Renaissance thought and Enlightenment thought is that Enlightenment tends to specialize, and it tends to objectify its object of inquiry. The biologist studies living beings. The physicist studies physical beings. The economist studies economies. The management specialist studies management. The doctor studies the body. The psychologist studies the mind. In fact, now, a lot of these that I just mentioned, like the idea of an economist, a psychologist, a physicist, these are very recent ideas. If you go back to the Bhagavad Gita or the Bible, you don't hear much reference to economies or psychology. These specialized fields only emerged later in modernity. Now, when we contrast that type of thinking, which again is good in many ways, it's very good for producing technology, but it lacks in many other ways. When we see that when we contrast it with the Renaissance thinker, because the Renaissance thinker follows the ancient forefathers in trying to attain knowledge of the whole rather than the part. He wants knowledge of the universal rather than particulars. Now, in this view, knowledge is something that's integrated into the entire human person. And this human person is a whole. It's an aggregation of mind and materiality, body and soul, biological faculties of sense, hearing, vision, taste, touch, sound, intellectual faculties of the mind, moral and aesthetic faculties, moral faculties of ethical behavior, morality, aesthetic faculties of taste. All of these things are taken together as a human person. And in trying to understand our forefathers and the Renaissance thinkers, in trying to understand the external world, the macrocosm, the world out there, scientifically, it was multidisciplinary because they wanted to understand the totality of the world, and because they related understanding and studying the totality of the world with understanding the human person, the totality of a human person as the microcosm, as a reflection of the macrocosm. So all knowledge was multidisciplinary. Now, like I said, it may be that Renaissance knowledge is not the best for producing technological advancement, although there was a lot of technological advancement in the Renaissance period, just not as rapid as we have have today. But when you think about it that way, would the world have been a better place if Leonardo da Vinci had simply confined his genius to painting or to architecture or to one field? And I think when we really look at that, if we take that question seriously, we have to say no. And today, look at our world today. We have great technologies that help us live more comfortably and longer. But that comfort and that longevity also comes at the cost of what a Renaissance man would call living, namely the achievement of human excellence. Now, many people today you'll hear about are talking about artificial intelligence and how this is a threat to jobs in the new economy. Soon machines will be able to do the work we are doing now. But you have to ask yourself, is that because machines have suddenly become more intelligent than people or better than people? No. The answer isn't that machines have become better than us, except in brute dyadic functions. You know, a calculator, a computer is better at calculation than I am, or that you are. It's faster. But it's not better than us in any way. It's the only reason we would even entertain the notion that it is because we have degraded ourselves by taking on these brute dyadic functions that a machine can do. Artificial intelligence can do calculations thousands of times faster than Leonardo da Vinci. It's not going to paint the Last Supper. It's not a Renaissance man. We feel threatened by artificial intelligence because we limit ourselves. We think of ourselves as machines doing a mechanical job to get money, to buy this and that, get married, then produce little copies of ourselves who also do mechanical jobs, get money, do this, get this and that, get married, on and on and on and on we go. Now, Leonardo da Vinci wouldn't feel threatened by artificial intelligence because Leonardo didn't think of himself as a machine, as a cog, as a part, but as a person, as a man created in the image of God who had a duty to pursue excellence for its own sake and for the sake of his creator. Now, to the students in the audience, I don't want you to go home and tell your parents you're going to go run off, become painters like Leonardo da Vinci, and that you don't need to get a job and that you're not setting out to the man. Don't do that. Please. Listen to your parents, respect their wisdom, and work hard to get a job so they can find you a spouse and we can continue the race. Now, we aren't in the Renaissance. You in 3 or 4 generations won't be working on a temple. You won't be in the same field. You won't be building cathedrals or monuments to human civilization. It's kind of sad when you think about it that you won't be able to do that because there's a lot that can be said about that life. Nevertheless, we're in the reality we're in. We're in a global capitalist economy, and we're expected quite often to do mundane economic duties. This is more so even in South Asia than elsewhere, because we have such a surplus of labor. However, and here's where I want to be very, very clear, we don't have to give up our humanity to fit in with the contemporary economy. We don't have to reduce our education to nothing but mechanical processes, like programming a computer or using the latest management theories to direct workers as if they were an ant colony. We don't have to write off our artistic, our cultural, our religious traditions, our heritage, in order to try and think like computers or like many of the science popularizers today who are such hard-headed, hard-hearted rationalists who only think logically, have no feelings, no emotions, no nothing. This is utter ridiculousness. We don't have to be part of some globally homogeneous, useful crew who are dedicated to nothing more than production and consumption, right? Now, how can we free ourselves from these economic and social pressures, which are by all means real and are found here in our contemporary culture? We do it the same way the Renaissance man did, by slowing down and looking back. Our forefathers, always, all of us, were left a great gift, wisdom. Now this wisdom is reflected to us in our culture, and we only need to take the time to turn and look at what is already there, what we've inherited, and try to cultivate ourselves, physically, mentally, and spiritually, as whole human beings, not merely as exam takers, not merely as students, not merely as mechanized parts of a productive process. And now, this is ultimately, unfortunately, again, especially in South Asia, this is something we must generally do on our own. The educational systems today look at education as job training. I'm going to teach you this so you can get a job. You're going to learn these computer programs. You're going to learn this language, not to experience the art and culture, but to become an interpreter, to become a translator, do this. And this is where this mechanical, inhuman way of life I'm speaking about becomes enculturated. The children become enculturated with this through these educational systems, unfortunately. So therefore, it's not really practical to depend on these same institutions to teach how to be human. Although as educators, this is precisely what we should be doing. We should be, no matter what our subject, trying to emphasize ways that can teach our students to be more human. And the students hopefully take this on as their responsibility to learn to be more human. But at the end of the day, everybody is responsible for their own education. And to be responsible for your own education, one of the first things I think you must do, absolutely, cultivate your own curiosity. We can't be multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary without being curious about other disciplines. This is a bad thing in South Asia again. We teach too often to the exam. We try to kill the curiosity of the children. So what they become good at is taking exams and doing what they're told. They do not develop curiosity. They do not read anything outside of what is assigned to them. Second, we have to learn to value knowledge for its own sake. I didn't start studying philosophy, religion, or Sanskrit so that I could apply Sanskrit to computer programming or apply philosophy to mineral processing. Second, we have to learn to value knowledge for its own sake. I didn't start to study philosophy and religion or Sanskrit so that I could apply Sanskrit to computer programming, or apply religion to mineral processing, or apply philosophy to mining. I studied these things because studying them is valuable in their own right. I didn't even study these things really to become a better person, although they do make me a better person. I do it because it's valuable to know. Like Aristotle said in the Metaphysics, man by nature desires to know. And since I'm a man, I desire to know. I desire knowledge, therefore I put in the work that is required to know, knowing that it's a never-ending process. But this is ultimately a process of self-cultivation, if not self-creation. Now all the youngsters, especially men and women today, they look like they spend an hour, 2 hours in front of the mirror in the morning working on their appearance and following all the latest fashions and dressing funny. Now, why? This is because they want to present the absolute best version of themselves to the world. And this is natural. It's something we should encourage. Now, I'm not really convinced that eccentric haircuts and trying to make yourself look like Virat Kohli is really the aim that we need to be going for in society, but it's something, right? And so this shows you what that illustrates, though, is it shows us the importance of having an end in all human activity. All human activity is directed towards an end. This is really essentially the most important lesson we can learn from our ancestors. Human activity is always directed towards an end, And it's the quality of the end that determines the quality of an action. It's the quality of the end that determines the quality of our life. Now, if this means if we pursue education to get a degree certificate, we get a degree certificate, we don't get an education. If we do a job to get money, we're not really doing a job, because we don't do the job. We don't do the work for its own sake. We do the work to get money. And actually, if we keep doing this in all areas of our lives, we end up following a pattern where we do a lot of things for something else, and we never really do anything for ourselves. Our lives become instrumental. Everything we do is geared toward obtaining something else, and obtaining something else, and on and on and on. And as our lives become instrumental, our attitude that we take toward objects, that this is something to be used, is something that we start to take towards other people and ourselves. And when everything we do is for something else or to use something else, our person, ourself is lost. We become a means to an end rather than an end in ourselves, along with everything else. We lose our humanity. We become an object among objects. We exist, but we no longer live. Now, that's the biggest takeaway here. We want to avoid that. We as educators must teach our students to avoid this. And what our students must learn is this. If we're to maintain a world that's really worth living in, this idea of multidisciplinary ideas, multidisciplinary designs, multidisciplinary systems, we have to think of them not just as useful to obtain something else, not useful for various sectors of the socio-political or economic reality. Multidisciplinary ideas, systems, and designs are also the basis for maintaining our humanity in the face of an ever-increasing drive towards specialization that comes from those aforementioned sectors in the political and social reality. By returning to a view of multidisciplinarity, a holistic view of multidisciplinarity, hopefully we can come to remember a lesson from the Renaissance. Namely that man is the measure of all things, precisely because man is a unity. Man's a universal. It's a unity against which things are measured. Man is not just an object among objects. It is a unity, and it is the measure of things and the measure of his own humanity. Thank you.